The thunder of hooves echoed across the prairie as Harlan Tate rode into tropic, Utah territory, a storm brewing both in the sky and in his hardened heart. The year was 1878, and like the rough landscape that surrounded him, Harlan's edges remained unpolished, his words as coarse as the stubble that lined his jaw. He'd never needed to soften his approach, not until Willow Evans arrived and changed everything. Harlan dismounted from his chestnut stallion outside Peterson's general store, dust rising from his boots as they hit the packed earth. His 6'3" frame cast a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. At 32, his face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd lived rough under an unforgiving sky. His shoulders, broad and tense, carried the weight of a past he rarely discussed. "Damn beast nearly threw me," he muttered to no one in particular as he tied his horse to the hitching post. Worthless piece of horseflesh. The door to the general store swung open as Harlan approached, nearly colliding with a young woman whose arms were laden with packages. She stumbled, struggling to maintain her balance, and Harlan instinctively reached out to steady her, his calloused hands gripping her shoulders firmly. "Watch where you're going," he growled, his voice carrying the harshness of a man unaccustomed to gentle conversation. Willow Evans looked up at him, her green eyes widening in surprise. At 24, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with the frontier town. Her chestnut hair was pulled back neatly beneath a modest bonnet, wisps escaping to frame a face that combined strength and delicacy in equal measure. "I beg your pardon," she replied, her voice steady despite the momentary alarm that crossed her features. "I didn't see you there." Harlan grunted in response, releasing her as though her touch had burned him. "Ought to be more careful," he said, his tone clipped and impatient. "People can't be looking out for you all the time." Something in her expression shifted a small flinch that most wouldn't notice, but Harlan caught it. For the briefest moment, a shadow passed across her face, and he felt an unexpected twist in his gut. He didn't apologize, though. Harlan Tate didn't apologize. "Miss Evans," called out Mr. Peterson from inside the store, "you forgot your change." Harlan's eyebrows raised slightly. "You're the new schoolteacher." It wasn't a question, but Willow nodded anyway. "I arrived last week from Boston." "Boston," he repeated, as though the word itself carried some inherent flaw. "Long way from civilization, Miss Evans." "I find there's civilization wherever people choose to create it, Mr. Tate." Harlan Tate. Recognition flashed in her eyes, and Harlan knew his reputation had preceded him. Owner of the Double T Ranch, one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. Known for his fair dealings but harsh demeanor, a man who paid well but demanded much, a man who kept to himself. Well, Mr. Tate it was. She paused, seemingly searching for the right word. "Interesting meeting you." She moved past him, but Harlan found himself speaking again. "Those packages look heavy." "Where are you headed?" Willow hesitated, clearly weighing whether to accept any offer of assistance. "The schoolhouse. It's just down, I know where it is," he cut her off, then gestured to the packages. "Give them here." It wasn't a request, but a command, delivered in the same tone he used with his ranch hands. Willow's chin lifted slightly, a spark of defiance in her eyes that surprised him. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Tate, but I'm perfectly capable of—" "Didn't say you weren't capable," he interrupted again. "Said they look heavy. No sense struggling when I'm headed that direction anyway." This was a lie. He had no business near the schoolhouse, but something compelled him to extend the offer, rough as it was delivered. After a moment's consideration, Willow relinquished the packages. "Thank you," she said simply. They walked in silence down Tropic's Main Street, a curious pair drawing glances from townsfolk going about their business. The schoolmarm, barely a week in town, walking alongside the notorious rancher who rarely set foot in town except for supplies or business. "You picked a hard place to start teaching," Harlan finally said, breaking the silence. "These kids are mostly ranch and farm children, not much interested in book learning." Willow glanced at him. "Every child deserves an education, Mr. Tate. And in my experience, those who protest the loudest often have the most to gain from learning." Harlan snorted. "That right. And what do I have to gain from book learning, Miss Evans?" She looked at him directly then, her gaze unwavering. "Perhaps the vocabulary to express yourself beyond gruff commands and dismissals." He nearly stopped walking, surprised by her forthrightness. Most people in Tropic tiptoed around him, careful not to provoke his notorious temper. This slender woman from Boston seemed to have no such concerns. "Been expressing myself just fine for 32 years, he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "Never had complaints." "I doubt that very much, Mr. Tate," she said, a hint of a smile playing at her lips, "though I suspect few have been brave enough to voice them." They reached the schoolhouse, a modest wooden structure at the edge of town. Willow unlocked the door and held it open as Harlan carried the packages inside. The single room was neat but sparse, rows of benches facing a small desk, a blackboard mounted on the wall behind it. "Where do you want these?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty room. "On the desk is fine, thank you." Harlan deposited the packages and turned to leave, eager to escape the unfamiliar territory of the schoolhouse and the even more unfamiliar territory of conversing with the schoolteacher. "Mr. Tate," Willow called as he reached the door. "The town is having a social on Saturday evening, to welcome me apparently, though I told them it wasn't necessary. Will you be attending?" Harlan turned, his expression incredulous. "I don't do socials, Miss Evans." "Pity," she replied, already unpacking her parcels. "I was hoping to continue our stimulating conversation." He couldn't tell if she was mocking him or being sincere. Either way, it unsettled him. "Got a ranch to run," he said gruffly. "Cattle don't feed themselves." "No, I suppose they don't." She looked up at him then, those green eyes assessing him in a way that made him want to shift his feet. "Though I imagine even the notorious Harlan Tate must rest occasionally." "Notorious?" he frowned. "What have people been saying?" Willow straightened, clasping her hands in front of her. "Only that you're fair but demanding, that your word is your bond, and that you prefer the company of cattle to people." "Cattle are simpler," he said, surprising himself with the admission. "Simplicity has its appeal," she agreed. "But so does complexity, Mr. Tate." "Good day to you, and thank you for your assistance." It was a dismissal, polite but firm, and Harlan found himself back on the street without quite knowing how he got there. He stood for a moment, looking at the closed schoolhouse door, a strange sense of unfinished business nagging at him. He shook it off and headed back to his horse. He had supplies to collect and a ranch to return to. He had no business thinking about Boston schoolteachers with challenging green eyes and unflinching directness. But as he rode out of Tropic toward the Double T, Harlan found his thoughts returning to that brief flinch, that moment when his harsh words had caused something to flicker across Willow Evans's face. It bothered him more than it should have. "Get a grip, Tate," he muttered to himself as the town receded behind him. "She's just another tenderfoot Easterner who won't last a year out here." The sky darkened as clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the storm that had been threatening all day. Harlan urged his horse to a faster pace, determined to outrun both the weather and the unsettling thoughts of the new schoolteacher. The Double T Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of Utah territory, its boundaries marked by mountain ranges to the east and desert to the west. The main house stood on a gentle rise, a sturdy two-story structure built of local timber and stone that Harlan had constructed with his own hands over the course of 3 years. It was larger than he needed a fact his foreman, Frank Miller, often pointed out, but Harlan had built it with vague notions of family that had never materialized. Frank met him in the yard as Harlan dismounted. At 55, Frank had been with Harlan since the beginning, when the Double T was nothing more than a dream and a down payment. "Storm's coming in fast," Frank observed, taking the reins. "Got worried you might get caught in it." "Nearly did," Harlan replied, hauling his saddlebags over his shoulder. "Town was busier than usual." Frank raised an eyebrow. "That's so. Wouldn't have anything to do with the new schoolmarm, would it? Heard she's causing quite a stir." Harlan shot him a sharp look. "Why would the schoolteacher have anything to do with me?" "Didn't say she did," Frank replied mildly. "Just making conversation." "Well, make it about something useful," Harlan snapped. "Like how the new calves are doing, or if that fence line on the north pasture got fixed." Frank's weathered face remained impassive. After 15 years, he was impervious to Harlan's rough manner. "Calves are fine, fence is fixed, and Jenkins rode in about an hour ago saying he spotted rustlers near the East Creek." Harlan's irritation immediately shifted to alert concern. "Rustlers? How many?" "3, maybe 4 from what he could tell. They had a small herd, maybe 20 head, moving them through the narrow pass toward the territorial road. Our cattle, can't be sure, but they were moving mighty suspicious-like." Jenkins followed long as he could, but didn't want to get spotted alone. Harlan nodded, already calculating. "Get 5 men together. We ride at first light." "Storm might not have passed by then," Frank cautioned. "Then we ride wet," Harlan said flatly. "No one steals from the Double T." Frank nodded, knowing better than to argue. "I'll see to it. Cook's got supper nearly ready." Harlan grunted acknowledgement and headed for the house, his mind shifting from schoolteachers to rustlers. The latter, at least, was a problem he knew how to handle. The first drops of rain began to fall as he reached the porch, fat droplets that promised a drenching downpour to follow. The wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the house as Harlan stepped inside. The main room was warm, a fire already burning in the large stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Though the house was spacious, Harlan lived primarily in this room and his bedroom upstairs. The rest a formal dining room, a study, 3 additional bedrooms remained mostly unused, furnished but gathering dust. He dropped his saddlebags on a chair and moved to pour himself a whiskey from the decanter on the sideboard. The amber liquid caught the firelight as he swirled it in the glass before taking a long swallow, savoring the burn. Outside, the storm arrived in earnest, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rumbled overhead. Harlan stood by the fire, listening to the tempest rage, his thoughts drifting despite his best efforts to the woman he'd met in town. There had been something in her eyes, not just challenge, but understanding. As though she'd looked at him and seen past the gruff exterior to something he himself wasn't sure existed anymore. It was unsettling. "Boston," he muttered into his glass. "What the hell is she doing in Tropic?" The question lingered, unanswered, as the storm raged on into the night. The following day dawned clear and crisp, the storm having washed the landscape clean. Harlan and his men rode out at first light, following the trail Jenkins had described. The ground was muddy, making tracking easier, and by mid-morning they had located the rustlers' camp in a sheltered canyon 5 miles east of the Double T. 4 men huddled around a small fire, the stolen cattle penned in a makeshift corral of rope and branches. They were so confident in their isolation that they'd posted no lookout, a mistake Harlan intended to make them regret. He signaled to his men, who spread out to surround the camp. When they were in position, Harlan rode forward, his rifle resting casually across his saddle. "Morning," he called, his voice carrying across the canyon. "Seems you boys have some cattle that don't belong to you." The rustlers jumped to their feet, hands moving toward weapons, but they froze when they saw they were surrounded. "Now, I'm a reasonable man," Harlan continued, his tone belying the hard look in his eyes. "You return my cattle, leave your weapons, and ride out of here alive. Or you can try something stupid and my men will have the unpleasant task of burying what's left of you." The leader of the rustlers, a wiry man with a scar running down one cheek, narrowed his eyes. "You're outnumbered, mister." Harlan didn't blink. "Count again." The rustlers' gaze darted around the canyon rim, where Harlan's men had positioned themselves with rifles trained on the camp. After a tense moment, he slowly raised his hands. "No need for bloodshed," he said, trying to sound casual. "Must have been a misunderstanding. We found these cattle wandering loose. Save it." Harlan cut him off. "Your lies don't interest me. Drop your guns, all of you." One by one, the rustlers disarmed, placing their weapons on the ground. Harlan nodded to Frank, who rode forward to collect them. "Now your horses," Harlan ordered. "Saddles too." The scarred man's face darkened. "You can't leave us out here on foot." "Should have thought of that before you stole my cattle," Harlan replied without sympathy. "Town's about 15 miles that way." He gestured vaguely westward. "I suggest you start walking. We'll die out here without horses or guns." Another rustler protested. Harlan's expression remained impassive. "Not my problem. Be grateful I'm not stringing you up, which would be well within my rights." He turned to his men. "Get the cattle moving, and make sure these gentlemen understand what happens if they are ever seen near Double T land again." The message was delivered with enough force to ensure the rustlers would think twice before returning, though not enough to leave lasting damage. Harlan wasn't interested in killing, just in making a point. As they drove the recovered cattle back toward the ranch, Frank rode alongside Harlan. "That went easier than expected," he observed. Harlan nodded. "They were amateurs. Professionals wouldn't have made so many mistakes." "Still," Frank said, "might be worth mentioning to the sheriff next time you're in town." "Sheriff Morgan couldn't find his own reflection in a mirror," Harlan scoffed. "But I'll let him know." Frank was quiet for a moment, then said casually, "Guess that means you'll be going to that social on Saturday after all." Harlan shot him a sharp look. "What social?" "Town social. To welcome the new schoolteacher. Everyone's talking about it." Frank's expression remained innocent. "Figured if you're going to town anyway." "I'm not going to any social," Harlan said firmly. "I'll send a note to Morgan." Frank shrugged. "Suit yourself." "Just thought you might be curious about the woman who's got the whole town buzzing. Heard she stood up to old man Henderson when he tried to tell her how to run her classroom. Quite the spine on that one, apparently." Harlan said nothing, but the image of Willow Evans standing firm against Henderson, one of the wealthiest and most opinionated men in Tropic, brought an unexpected twist of something like admiration. "Don't you have work to do?" he finally asked Frank. "Or is gossiping about the schoolteacher part of your job now?" Frank chuckled, unperturbed by Harlan's gruffness. "Just making conversation, boss. Just making conversation." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but Frank's words had planted a seed in Harlan's mind. Maybe he would ride into town on Saturday after all. Not for the social, of course. Just to speak with Sheriff Morgan. The fact that the schoolhouse was right next door to the sheriff's office was merely a coincidence. Saturday arrived clear and warm, a perfect early autumn day. Harlan found himself standing before his bedroom mirror, scowling at his reflection as he attempted to tame his dark hair into some semblance of order. He'd bathed, a task he typically undertook with more efficiency than care, and put on his best shirt, a deep blue cotton that he usually reserved for business meetings in Salt Lake City. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, tossing the comb aside. He wasn't going to the social. He was just going to town on business. The fact that he'd spent an extra 10 minutes on his appearance meant nothing. Downstairs, Frank watched with barely concealed amusement as Harlan strapped on his gun belt. "Expecting trouble at the sheriff's office?" he asked mildly. Harlan glared at him. "I always wear my gun. And the clean shirt, that's standard procedure for reporting rustlers. Don't you have somewhere to be?" Harlan growled. Frank held up his hands in surrender, though the knowing smile remained. "Not a word, boss. Not a single word." Harlan rode into Tropic, just as the afternoon was giving way to evening. The town was more animated than usual, with people converging on the town hall where the social was being held. Lanterns had been strung along the porch, giving the simple building a festive air, and the sounds of conversation and laughter drifted out the open doors. Harlan resolutely turned his horse toward the sheriff's office, tying it to the hitching post outside. The office was dark, a note pinned to the door indicating that Sheriff Morgan could be found at the town social for any urgent matters. "Perfect," Harlan muttered, standing in indecision. He could leave a note about the rustlers, or he could wait until Monday when the sheriff would be back at his desk. Or, "Mr. Tate," a familiar voice called. He turned to see Willow Evans approaching, dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep green that made her eyes seem to glow in the early evening light. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than when he'd last seen her, soft curls framing her face while the rest was swept up. "Miss Evans," he acknowledged, tipping his hat slightly. "You look—" He faltered, unused to offering compliments. "Well." A smile touched her lips. "Thank you, you look rather well yourself. Are you here for the social after all?" "No," he said quickly. "Had business with the sheriff." She glanced at the darkened office. "Ah, I believe Sheriff Morgan is already at the town hall. He was helping arrange the tables when I left to fetch my shawl." She indicated the delicate lace shawl draped over her arm. "I'd be happy to walk back with you if you're headed that way." Harlan hesitated. The smart thing would be to say no, to leave his message with someone else or come back another day. Instead, he found himself nodding. "Lead the way." They walked side by side down Tropic's Main Street, an odd pair that drew curious glances from other townsfolk headed to the social. "I was surprised to see you," Willow admitted after a moment. "You made it quite clear that socials weren't to your taste." "They're not," he confirmed. "But rustlers don't report themselves." "Rustlers?" She looked up at him with genuine concern. "Were cattle stolen from your ranch, attempted theft. We recovered them." He was surprised by her interest, expecting the topic to be too unrefined for a Boston schoolteacher. "How awful." "Were you in danger?" Harlan shook his head. "They weren't professionals, more opportunists than organized thieves." "Still," she said, "it must have been frightening to confront them." "Not particularly," he replied honestly. "It's part of ranching out here, you get used to it." She studied him with those perceptive green eyes. "I'm not sure one ever gets used to confronting armed criminals, Mr. Tate. Perhaps you're simply braver than most." The compliment, delivered so matter-of-factly, caught him off guard. "Just doing what needs doing," he said gruffly. "Nothing brave about it." They reached the town hall, its windows glowing with lantern light. The sounds of music now joined the conversation. Someone was playing a fiddle inside, and people were clapping in rhythm. Harlan hesitated at the foot of the steps. "Sheriff will be busy with all this." "I'll come back Monday." "Nonsense," Willow said firmly. "The sheriff's duty doesn't pause for a social. Besides—" She paused, something like challenge in her eyes. "Are you really going to ride all the way back to your ranch without even a cup of coffee after coming all this way?" "I don't dance." she finished for him. "That's perfectly fine. Neither do I particularly. But I would welcome the company of someone who might discuss something other than the weather or how different Tropic is from wherever I've come from." Harlan found himself at a loss for words, an unusual state for a man who typically spoke his mind without hesitation. There was something about Willow Evans that disrupted his normal patterns, that made him conscious of his rough edges in a way he hadn't been in years. "1 cup of coffee," he finally conceded, "and a word with the sheriff. Then I'm heading back." Her smile was unexpectedly warm. "Agreed. Though I warn you, Mrs. Peterson's apple pie may tempt you to linger longer." Inside, the town hall had been transformed. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while the center of the room had been cleared for dancing. Most of Tropic's residents were there, from the wealthiest ranchers to the humblest shop owners. Children darted between the adults, playing some game of tag despite the admonishments of their parents. Harlan felt immediately out of place. He hadn't attended a town gathering in years, preferring the solitude of his ranch to the forced sociability of such events. Several people looked up in surprise as he entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness. Willow, seeming to sense his discomfort, took charge. "Let's find the sheriff first, shall we? Then coffee and perhaps some of that pie I mentioned." Sheriff Morgan was easy to spot, a tall, lean man with a gray mustache that drooped past his chin. He was engaged in conversation with Henderson and the town mayor, but looked up as Harlan approached. "Tate," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Didn't expect to be here," Harlan replied. "Need a word about some rustlers we caught on my land yesterday." The sheriff excused himself from his companions and moved to a quieter corner with Harlan, leaving Willow chatting with the mayor's wife. Harlan gave a concise report of the incident, describing the rustlers and where they'd last seen them. "You let them go?" Morgan asked, his bushy eyebrows rising. "Without horses or guns," Harlan confirmed. "Figured the walk would give them time to reconsider their life choices." Morgan nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I'll send word to neighboring counties to keep an eye out. You think they were passing through or local?" "Not local," Harlan said with certainty. "Didn't know the terrain well enough." Their business concluded, the sheriff clapped Harlan on the shoulder. "Appreciate you coming in, Tate. Now, since you're here, why not enjoy the social? Been too long since you showed your face at a town gathering." Harlan was about to decline when he caught sight of Willow across the room. She was listening intently to something the mayor's wife was saying, but her eyes met his briefly, and she offered a small smile that seemed meant just for him. "Maybe just for a bit," he heard himself say. The sheriff followed his gaze and grinned knowingly. "Ah, the new schoolmarm. Half the unmarried men in town are trying to catch her eye, you know. Even some of the married ones are looking more than they should." Harlan felt an unexpected surge of irritation at this information. "She seems capable of handling herself," he said, more curtly than he intended. "Oh, she is," Morgan agreed. "Turned down 3 dinner invitations that I know of, polite but firm from what I hear." He gave Harlan a sideways glance. "Interesting that she's the one who brought you in tonight." "She didn't bring me in," Harlan corrected. "We happened to arrive at the same time." "If you say so," Morgan replied, clearly unconvinced. "Well, don't let me keep you from your coffee." Harlan made his way to the refreshment table where Mrs. Peterson was serving coffee with an enthusiasm that suggested it might contain more than just coffee. He accepted a cup and was taking his first sip when Willow joined him. "Mission accomplished?" she asked, accepting her own cup from Mrs. Peterson with a smile of thanks. Harlan nodded. "Sheriff's been informed. Doubt he'll do much, but at least it's on record. I'm learning that out here people often have to take care of their own problems," she observed, selecting a small slice of pie from the table. That's right, Harlan agreed. Laws spread thin. Have to rely on yourself more often than not. I understand the necessity, Willow said, but I wonder if it sometimes leads to isolation. Taking care of oneself is admirable, but it can become a habit that excludes the possibility of community. Harlan looked at her sharply. You suggesting I'm isolated, Miss Evans? She met his gaze directly. Aren't you? The bluntness of her response surprised him. Most people in Tropic tiptoed around him, careful not to provoke his notorious temper. This slip of a woman from Boston seemed to have no such concerns. I have my ranch hands, he said defensively. Frank's been with me 15 years. Employees are not the same as friends or community, she pointed out gently. When was the last time you attended a gathering like this? Not for business, but simply to be among your neighbors. Harlan couldn't remember which was answer enough. He took another sip of his coffee, using the moment to gather his thoughts. Not much for socializing, he finally said. Never have been. People talk too much and say too little. Willow smiled at that. A fair assessment of many conversations, I'll grant you, but not all. Some people have quite a lot to say if given the chance. Like schoolteachers from Boston, he asked, a hint of challenge in his tone. Like anyone with a story to tell, she corrected. Which is everyone, Mr. Tate. Everyone has a story, even the quietest, most reserved rancher in Tropic. He felt exposed under her gaze, as though she could see past the armor he'd built over years of solitude. It was unsettling, but not entirely unpleasant. My story's not that interesting, he said gruffly. I disagree, she replied. I think a man who built one of the largest ranches in the territory from nothing must have quite an interesting story indeed. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by Henderson's eldest son, a lanky young man of about 20 who had clearly bolstered his courage with whatever was being added to the coffee. Miss Evans, he said, bowing slightly, would you do me the honor of the next dance? Willow's smile was polite but distant. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Henderson, but I'm engaged in conversation at the moment. Young Henderson glanced at Harlan with poorly concealed irritation. Surely Mr. Tate wouldn't mind. He's not one for dancing anyway, are you, Tate? There was a slight edge to the young man's voice that set Harlan's teeth on edge. He was about to respond, likely with more force than the situation warranted, when Willow placed a gentle hand on his arm. As I said, we're in the middle of a conversation, she repeated, her tone firmer. Perhaps another time. Henderson lingered for a moment, clearly debating whether to press the issue, before nodding curtly and withdrawing. Persistent, Harlan observed, trying to ignore the lingering warmth where her hand had touched his arm. Entitled, Willow corrected. He assumes because his father owns half the businesses in town that I should be flattered by his attention. She shook her head slightly. I've encountered his type before. Something in her tone made Harlan look at her more closely. In Boston, she nodded, her expression growing distant. Yes. In Boston. There was a story there, Harlan realized, one that perhaps explained why a well-educated woman from the East had chosen to take a teaching position in a small frontier town. But before he could decide whether to ask, the moment was broken by the arrival of Mrs. Peterson, who insisted they try her special apple pie. The evening progressed in a way Harlan could never have anticipated. His 1 cup of coffee extended to 2, then 3, as he found himself drawn into conversation not just with Willow but with other townsfolk who, encouraged by her example, approached him with questions about the ranch or comments about the weather that gradually evolved into more substantial discussions. He discovered that the blacksmith's youngest son had a knack for working with horses, that the widow Johnson was looking to sell her late husband's small parcel of land that bordered the Double T, that the new doctor was hoping to organize a group to build a proper clinic instead of working out of his living room. Through it all, Willow remained nearby, sometimes participating in the conversations, sometimes drifting to speak with others but always returning to where Harlan stood, as though drawn by some invisible thread. "You're enjoying yourself," she observed during a quiet moment, her voice teasing. "Admit it. It's not entirely unpleasant," he conceded, which earned him a laugh that seemed to warm him from the inside out. "High praise indeed from Harlan Tate," she said. "I shall have to mark the calendar." The use of his first name didn't escape his notice, nor did the way it sounded in her voice less harsh somehow, softened by her accent that still carried traces of the East despite her efforts to blend in. The evening was winding down, families with young children already departed when Willow stifled a yawn behind her hand. "Forgive me," she said. "It's been a long week of teaching." "I should be heading back anyway," Harlan said, suddenly aware of how long he'd stayed. "It's a fair ride to the ranch." "Thank you for the company," she said sincerely. "It made the evening much more enjoyable." "I should be thanking you," he replied, surprising himself with his honesty. "Wouldn't have come in at all if not for you." She raised an eyebrow. "For me?" "I thought you came to report rustlers." "That too," he admitted. "But—" He trailed off, unsure how to explain that something about her had drawn him to town, had made him curious in a way he hadn't been in years. Willow seemed to understand without him finishing the thought. "Well, whatever the reason, I'm glad you came." She gathered her shawl around her shoulders. "I should be going. School starts early, even on Monday." "I'll walk you," Harlan said, not quite making it a question. She smiled. "I'd like that." They said their goodbyes to the remaining guests, Harlan nodding awkwardly as several people expressed surprise and pleasure at seeing him at the social. Outside, the night was clear and cool, stars blazing overhead in the vast Utah sky. "It's not far," Willow said as they began walking. "The school board has provided a small cabin behind the schoolhouse for my accommodation." "Comfortable?" Harlan asked, genuinely curious about her living conditions. "Comfortable enough," she replied. "It's certainly more spacious than my rooms in Boston, though somewhat lacking in amenities. The stove smokes terribly when the wind is from the east." "That can be fixed," Harlan said immediately. "Just needs the chimney adjusted. I could come by tomorrow." He stopped, realizing he was offering services like a handyman rather than the owner of the largest ranch in the county. But Willow didn't seem to find the offer strange. "Would you? That would be wonderful. I've been opening all the windows, but with winter coming." "I'll stop by after church," he promised, then added, "If you attend." "I do," she confirmed. "Though I confess I find Reverend Philip's sermons somewhat longer than necessary." Harlan chuckled, a rusty sound he hardly recognized as his own. "That's putting it mildly. Man could talk the ears off a mule." They reached the small cabin behind the schoolhouse, a simple one-room structure with a covered porch. A lantern hung by the door, which Willow lit with practiced ease. "Thank you for walking me home," she said, turning to face him in the warm glow of the lantern light. "And for the promise of chimney repair." Harlan nodded, suddenly awkward now that they had reached their destination. "It's no trouble." A moment of silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged with something Harlan couldn't quite name. "Well," Willow finally said. "Good night, Mr. Tate." "Harlan," he corrected. "If we're going to be friends, you might as well use my name." Her smile was worth the momentary vulnerability of the offer. "Good night, Harlan. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow." "Good night, Willow," he replied, her first name feeling strange but right on his tongue. He waited until she was safely inside before turning to walk back to where his horse was hitched outside the town hall. The night was quiet, most of Tropic already tucked in for the night, but Harlan felt more awake than he had in years. Something had changed tonight, something he couldn't quite define, but that left him feeling both unsettled and more alive than he could remember feeling in a long time. As he rode back to the Double T under the vast canopy of stars, Harlan found himself thinking about chimneys and stoves and the way Willow's eyes caught the lantern light. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the solitude of the ride felt more like loneliness than peace. The next day, Harlan sat in the back pew of Tropic's small church, his attention divided between Reverend Philip's droning sermon and the slender figure of Willow Evans seated several rows ahead. She was dressed in a modest blue dress, her hair arranged simply beneath a matching bonnet. Several times during the service, she glanced back, catching his eye with a small smile that made him forget the Reverend entirely. True to his word, once the service ended and the requisite socializing had been endured, Harlan made his way to Willow's cabin. She had changed from her church clothes into a simpler skirt and blouse, her hair now loosely braided over one shoulder. "Right on time," she said, opening the door before he could knock. "I was just making tea. Would you like some?" "Thank you," he said, stepping into the small cabin and removing his hat. The interior was neat and modestly furnished: a bed in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf overflowing with volumes, and the problematic stove against one wall. Despite its simplicity, the cabin had a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Willow had made it a home with small touches: a colorful quilt on the bed, a vase of wildflowers on the table, a painting of a Boston harbor scene hung on one wall. "It's not much," she said, following his gaze, "but it suits me." "It's nice," he said honestly. "Homey." He moved to examine the stove and chimney, quickly identifying the problem. "Flue's not set right. Chimney cap needs adjusting too. I have tools in my saddlebag." While Willow prepared the tea, Harlan set to work on the stove. It was a simple repair, one he could do in his sleep, but he found himself taking extra care, wanting to ensure everything was perfect. "Where did you learn to do this?" Willow asked, setting a steaming cup of tea on the table for him. "Necessity," he replied, making a final adjustment. "When I first came out here, there wasn't anyone to call when something broke. Had to figure it out myself." "How old were you?" 17 when I left home in Missouri. 19 when I staked my claim on what became the Double T." Willow looked impressed. "That's remarkably young to start a ranch on your own." Harlan shrugged, uncomfortable with what felt like praise. "Wasn't much back then. Just me, Frank, and about 50 head of cattle. Lived in a tent the first year." "And now it's one of the largest ranches in the territory," she said. "That's quite an accomplishment." He wiped his hands on a rag, avoiding her eyes. "Just did what needed doing." He gestured to the stove. "Should work properly now. Want to test it." Willow lit the stove and they watched as the fire caught and the smoke drew properly up the chimney. "Perfect," she said with a smile. "Thank you, Harlan." He nodded, taking a seat at the table and reaching for his now lukewarm tea. "It's no trouble. Still, I appreciate it." She sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own cup. "I've been trying to learn to do things for myself since coming west, but some tasks remain beyond my abilities." "Why did you come?" he asked, the question that had been nagging at him since their first meeting. "Boston to Tropic is a hell of a change." Willow was quiet for a moment, her eyes on her tea. "I needed a fresh start," she finally said. "Boston had too many memories." There was pain in her voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Harlan felt a surge of protectiveness, followed immediately by curiosity. "Bad memories?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Some," she admitted. "I was engaged to be married." She twisted a loose thread on her sleeve, not meeting his eyes. "He was from a prominent family. Very charming, very persistent. When I ended the engagement, he didn't take it well. The hesitation in her voice raised Harlan's hackles. Didn't take it well how? She looked up then, something like defiance in her eyes. He became angry, frightening, made threats, followed me. When he grabbed me on the street one day, she stopped, taking a breath. I decided it would be better to make a completely fresh start, somewhere far away. Harlan's hands had tightened around his cup as she spoke, anger building in his chest at the faceless man who had frightened her enough to drive her across the country. He hurt you. The words came out rougher than he intended, almost a growl. Not physically in the end. Others intervened that day. She held his gaze steadily, but he hurt my sense of safety, my trust. It took me some time to rebuild both. Harlan wanted to ask more, wanted to know the man's name, wanted to know if he had followed her west, wanted to promise that no one would ever threaten her again, but he held back, recognizing that she had already shared more than he had any right to expect. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said instead, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you." She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's in the past now. Tropic is my present and hopefully my future as well." "The town's lucky to have you," Harlan said, surprising himself with the sincerity of the sentiment. "The children, too." Her smile warmed. "That's kind of you to say. I'm enjoying teaching here more than I expected. The children are eager to learn despite what you suggested when we first met." Harlan had the grace to look sheepish. "I might have been wrong about that." Harlan Tate, admitting he was wrong, she teased. "Should I mark this day on the calendar as well?" "Don't push your luck," he replied, but there was no heat in his words, and the corner of his mouth twitched with the hint of a smile. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing more easily than Harlan would have thought possible. He found himself sharing stories of the early days of the ranch, the brutal first winter, the spring flood that nearly washed away their first real cabin, the mountain lion that had stalked their cattle until Harlan tracked and killed it after a 3-day hunt. In turn, Willow told him about growing up in Boston, her father a professor at Harvard, her mother a talented pianist who had given up a promising career to raise her family. She spoke of her decision to become a teacher, her love of literature, her belief that education was the key to a better future for the children of Tropic. When Harlan finally realized how long he had stayed, he rose reluctantly. "I should get back to the ranch. Got work waiting." "Of course," Willow said, standing as well. "Thank you again for fixing the stove. I'm sure I'll sleep much better without having to choose between smoke or freezing." At the door, Harlan hesitated. "There's a box social next Saturday, for the church building fund." "Yes, I've heard about it," Willow replied. "I'm planning to attend." "Maybe I'll see you there," he said, not quite making it a question. Her smile was answer enough. "I'd like that. I'll be the one with the blue checkered cloth on my basket." Harlan nodded, understanding the implied invitation. At a box social, women prepared boxed meals that were auctioned off, with the highest bidder earning the right to share the meal with the cook. It was a common frontier matchmaking tradition, thinly disguised as a fundraiser. "Blue checkered cloth," he repeated. "I'll remember." As he rode back to the Double T, Harlan found himself smiling without realizing it, already looking forward to Saturday with an anticipation that would have embarrassed him if anyone had been there to see it. The week passed in a blur of ranch work, cattle to move to lower pastures before the first frost, fences to mend, supplies to order for the winter months ahead. Through it all, Harlan found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to Willow, to the way she had shared her past with him, trusting him with her pain, to the sound of her laugh when he'd told her about Frank falling into the creek while trying to impress a saloon girl from Virginia City. Frank noticed the change in his boss, though he was wise enough not to comment directly. Still, Harlan caught the knowing looks, the barely concealed smiles when he announced on Friday that he needed to ride into town the next day. "Church fundraiser," Harlan said gruffly when Frank raised an eyebrow. "Figure the double T should support the community." "Of course," Frank agreed, his tone suspiciously neutral. "Very community-minded of you, boss." Harlan glared at him. "You got something to say, Frank?" The older man shook his head, but his eyes were twinkling. "Not a word, boss, not a single word." Saturday dawned bright and cool, a perfect autumn day. Harlan spent more time than he would ever admit getting ready, bathing thoroughly, trimming his beard, selecting his best clothes. By the time he rode into Tropic, the box social was already underway in the churchyard. Tables had been set up under the trees, decorated with autumn leaves and wildflowers. A collection of baskets lined one table, each covered with a different cloth to identify it. Harlan's eyes immediately sought the blue checkered cloth, finding it on a modest basket near the end of the table. Reverend Phillips was acting as auctioneer, his booming voice carrying across the churchyard as he extolled the virtues of each basket in turn. Harlan waited patiently, nodding to acquaintances, until Willow's basket came up for bid. "And here we have a lovely basket, covered in blue checked cloth," the Reverend announced. "I'm told the contents include fried chicken, biscuits, and a special apple tart. Who'll start the bidding at 50 cents? Several hands went up immediately, including young Henderson's. Harlan waited, watching the bidding climb steadily as men dropped out one by one. When it reached $3, already a high price for a box lunch, only Henderson remained. $3 going once, the Reverend called. "Going twice, $5, Harlan said clearly, his voice carrying across the churchyard. A hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned to him. Henderson's face darkened with anger and embarrassment, but he quickly recovered. $6, he countered. Harlan didn't hesitate. $10. The gasps were audible. $10 was an extravagant sum for a box lunch, even for a charity auction. Henderson looked as though he might continue the bidding war, but his father placed a restraining hand on his arm, whispering something that made the young man's face flush red before he nodded stiffly. $10 going once, the Reverend called, barely concealing his delight at the unexpected windfall for the church fund. Going twice, sold to Mr. Tate for $10. Harlan approached the table to claim his prize, aware of the curious and speculative glances following him. Willow stood nearby, her expression a mixture of surprise and something softer that made his heart beat faster. $10 is quite a lot for fried chicken, she said quietly as he reached her. Worth every penny, he replied, offering his arm. Shall we find a spot to eat? They settled under a large oak tree at the edge of the churchyard, far enough from the other diners to have some privacy, but still within sight of the community gathering. Willow spread a blanket on the ground and began unpacking the basket, revealing the promised fried chicken, biscuits, and apple tart, along with a jar of lemonade and some pickled vegetables. "This looks delicious," Harlan said honestly. "Thank you." A hint of color touched her cheeks. "I must confess, I'm not the most accomplished cook. These are my few reliable recipes." "Better than anything I could manage," he assured her. "Unless you have a taste for beans straight from the can," she laughed, the sound making something warm unfurl in his chest. "Fortunately, I don't. Though I imagine ranch life requires more practical than fancy cooking." "Frank does most of it," Harlan admitted. "He claims it's self-defense after tasting my attempts." They ate companionably, the conversation flowing easily between them. Harlan found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did in public, the usual tension in his shoulders easing as they talked. Willow had a gift for asking questions that drew him out without making him feel interrogated, and he found himself sharing thoughts and opinions he rarely voiced. "You surprise me," she said at one point, her head tilted slightly as she studied him. "How's that?" he asked, curious. "You have this reputation for being difficult, harsh. And you can be," she added with a small smile, "but there's more depth to you than I think most people realize." Harlan shifted uncomfortably under her perceptive gaze. "Don't know about that. I'm just a rancher." "You're more than just anything," she corrected gently. "You're complex and thoughtful and far more intelligent than you let on." He wasn't sure how to respond to that. No one had ever described him in such terms before. Most people in Tropic would have used words like stubborn or taciturn or, less charitably, ornery. "You're seeing what you want to see," he finally said. "I'm seeing what's there," she countered. "Perhaps because I'm looking more carefully than most." Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that made Harlan's heart hammer in his chest. Then Willow looked away, reaching for the apple tart. "Dessert," she offered, breaking the moment. As they shared the tart, Harlan gathered his courage. "Would you like to come out to the double T sometime? Sunday, maybe. I could show you the ranch." The invitation surprised even him. He rarely welcomed visitors to the ranch, considering it his private domain. But the thought of Willow there, seeing the life he'd built, mattered to him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Her face lit up. "I'd love that. I've heard so much about the double T, I'm curious to see it for myself." "It's about an hour's ride," he said. "I could come fetch you after church." "Perfect," she agreed. "I'll look forward to it." As they packed up the remains of their lunch, Henderson approached, his expression carefully neutral though his eyes were cold. "Miss Evans," he said, nodding stiffly. "Tate, Mr. Henderson," Willow replied politely. "Did you enjoy your lunch?" "Well enough," he said dismissively, before turning to Harlan. "Quite the generous bid, Tate. $10 would buy a lot of lumber for the church." There was an edge to his voice that set Harlan's teeth on edge. "Happy to support a good cause," he replied evenly. Henderson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed. Though some might wonder if the cause you're supporting is the church or something altogether more personal." Harlan stiffened, his hands clenching at his sides. "You got something to say, Henderson. Say it plainly." Before the situation could escalate, Willow stepped between them, her hand coming to rest lightly on Harlan's arm. "Mr. Henderson, your father is looking for you," she said, nodding toward where the elder Henderson stood watching them with a frown. "And Harlan, would you mind helping me carry this basket back to my cabin? It's heavier than I expected." Henderson looked as though he might argue, but after a tense moment, he nodded curtly and walked away. Harlan remained rigid until Willow's hand squeezed his arm gently. "He's not worth it," she said quietly. Harlan took a deep breath, forcing his muscles to relax. "He was insulting you." "He was trying to provoke you," she corrected, "and nearly succeeded. Come, walk with me. The basket really is rather heavy." As they left the churchyard, Harlan was acutely aware of the eyes following them, the whispers that would no doubt flow once they were out of earshot. For the first time in years, he found himself caring what others thought, not for his own sake, but for Willow's. "People will talk," he said as they walked toward her cabin. "Seeing us together like this." "People always talk," she replied with a small shrug. "It's what they do in small towns. Boston was no different in that regard. Doesn't bother you what they might say." She stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Does it bother you?" Harlan considered the question seriously. Once it would have. Once he would have avoided any situation that invited speculation or gossip, preferring his solitude to the complications of social entanglements. But now, looking at Willow's upturned face, he found that it mattered far less than the possibility of seeing that face light up with a smile meant only for him. "No," he said honestly. "It doesn't." Her answering smile was worth any amount of gossip. "Good. Because I find I enjoy your company very much, Harlan Tate, regardless of what anyone else might think about it." They continued walking, closer now, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Harlan felt a lightness he couldn't remember experiencing before, as though something long tight within him had finally begun to loosen. At her cabin door, Willow turned to him again. "Thank you for bidding on my basket, and for the company." "Thank you for the meal," he replied, "and for everything else." She smiled, understanding what he couldn't quite put into words. "Until tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow," he agreed, reluctantly taking his leave. As he rode back to the Double T, Harlan found himself planning what to show Willow the next day, which parts of the ranch she might find most interesting, whether she'd enjoy riding to the high meadow where the view stretched all the way to the distant mountains. It occurred to him that he was behaving like a lovesick boy, but for once, he didn't care. The anticipation of tomorrow was too sweet to tarnish with self-consciousness. Sunday dawned clear but with a hint of frost in the air, the first real sign that winter was approaching. After church, during which Harlan found it nearly impossible to concentrate on Reverend Philip's sermon with Willow sitting just a few pews ahead, they set out for the Double T. Harlan had brought a gentle mare for Willow to ride, a wise choice as it quickly became apparent that while she could ride, she wasn't experienced on horseback. Still, she was a quick learner, and by the time they reached the ranch, she was sitting more confidently in the saddle. "It's beautiful," she said as they crested the final rise, giving her the first view of the ranch spread out below. The main house stood on its gentle hill, surrounded by various outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and other structures necessary for a working cattle operation. Beyond, pastures stretched to the horizon, dotted with the dark shapes of cattle. "It's home," Harlan said simply, but he felt a surge of pride at her approval. They rode down to the main house, where Frank was waiting on the porch. His eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of Willow, but he greeted her with courteous warmth. "Miss Evans, welcome to the Double T. The boss has been telling us about the fine job you're doing with the school." Harlan shot him a warning look, having said no such thing, but Willow just smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. It's a pleasure to finally see the ranch I've heard so much about." Frank helped her dismount, then took the reins of both horses. "I'll see to these. You two go on in. Cook's left some coffee and pie in the kitchen." Inside, Harlan felt suddenly self-conscious. The house was clean and well-maintained, but decidedly masculine, lacking the feminine touches that might soften its utilitarian nature. Still, Willow moved through the rooms with genuine interest, admiring the craftsmanship of the furniture, the view from the windows, the large fireplace that dominated the main room. "You built this yourself?" she asked, running her hand along the mantel. "Most of it," he confirmed. "Had help with some of the heavier work, but the design was mine." "It's impressive," she said sincerely, "spacious too, much larger than I would have expected for a bachelor." Harlan shifted uncomfortably. "Had notions of family when I built it," he admitted. "Never quite worked out that way." She looked at him with those perceptive green eyes. "There's still time." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with possibility. Harlan cleared his throat. "Coffee. Then I thought I'd show you the rest of the ranch." The afternoon passed pleasantly as Harlan gave Willow a tour of the Double T. They visited the barn, where she charmed the stable hands by asking intelligent questions about the horses. They walked through the nearest pasture, where Willow fed apples to the gentle milk cow that supplied the ranch. They rode to the creek that provided water for both cattle and household. where Harlan showed her the irrigation system he'd designed to ensure water even in the driest months. Throughout it all, Harlan found himself seeing the ranch through new eyes. What had become routine and ordinary to him over the years suddenly seemed impressive and worthy of pride when viewed through Willow's perspective. "You've created something remarkable here," she said as they sat by the creek, resting before the ride back. "It's not just a ranch. It's a complete world." "Just did what needed doing," he replied, but the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "You do yourself a disservice when you say that," she observed. "Building all this required vision, determination, intelligence. It's an achievement worthy of recognition." Harlan looked away, unused to such direct praise. "Had plenty of help. Frank's been with me from the start. Couldn't have done it without him." "Accepting help doesn't diminish the accomplishment," she said gently. "If anything, knowing when to rely on others shows wisdom." He glanced at her then, struck by the thought that she understood him in ways few others had bothered to try. "You've got a gift for seeing the best in people," he said. "Not always," she admitted. "I've made my share of misjudgments, but I try to look beyond the surface." She met his eyes directly. "Some people make that easier than others." There was something in her gaze that made Harlan's heart race. Before he could respond, however, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. Frank appeared on the ridge above them, riding hard. "Boss," he called. "Got trouble at the north pasture. Henderson's men are claiming our cattle crossed onto their land." Harlan was on his feet immediately, the peaceful moment shattered. "How many men?" "4 of them. Armed." Harlan turned to Willow, apology in his eyes. "I need to deal with this." "Of course," she said, rising as well. "What can I do?" He hesitated, then made a quick decision. "Come with us to the house. You can wait there until this is sorted out." They rode quickly back to the main house, where several ranch hands were already mounting up. Harlan helped Willow down from her horse, then turned to Frank. "Get her safely back to town if I'm not back by sunset." "I can wait," Willow protested. "Might not be back till late," Harlan replied. "This could take a while to sort out." She nodded reluctantly. "Be careful." Henderson's son seemed quite angry yesterday. "I've handled worse," he assured her then on impulse, took her hand and squeezed it briefly before mounting his horse. "I'll come to town tomorrow, let you know how it turned out." As he rode out with his men, Harlan glanced back to see Willow standing on the porch, her hand raised in farewell, her figure growing smaller as the distance between them increased. The confrontation at the north pasture was tense, but ultimately anticlimactic. Henderson's men were surly, but backed down when faced with Harlan and 6 of his ranch hands. The cattle in question were clearly double T animals that had simply wandered near the property line, not even crossing it, as had been claimed. After some posturing and veiled threats, Henderson's foreman agreed to withdraw, though not without promising that this isn't over. It was well after dark when Harlan returned to the ranch, tired and dusty, but satisfied that the immediate conflict had been resolved. As he dismounted in the yard, Frank emerged from the bunkhouse. "Everything settled?" he asked. Harlan nodded. "For now. Henderson's playing games, trying to push boundaries. We'll need to keep a closer eye on that section of the range." "I'll set up extra patrols," Frank promised. Then, casually, "Miss Evans waited as long as she could. Sent her back to town with Jenkins about an hour ago." Harlan felt a pang of disappointment that he quickly masked. "Good. Wasn't right to keep her waiting all day." Frank studied him for a moment, then said carefully, "She's a fine woman, boss. Smart, strong-minded." "Yes, she is," Harlan agreed, waiting for the inevitable follow-up. "Seems to think highly of you, too," Frank continued, his tone deliberately casual. Harlan busied himself with his saddle, avoiding Frank's knowing gaze. "She's just being polite. Frank snorted. Didn't get to be my age by being blind, boss. That woman looks at you like you hung the moon, and you look at her like she's water in the desert. Harlan straightened, ready to deny it, but the words died on his lips. What was the point of lying to Frank, who knew him better than anyone? Instead, he asked, "That obvious?" "To anyone with eyes," Frank confirmed. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" It was a good question, one Harlan had been asking himself with increasing frequency over the past weeks. What exactly was he doing with Willow Evans? Where was this path leading them? And was he, Harlan Tate, confirmed bachelor and solitary rancher, ready for where it might end? "Don't know yet," he admitted. Frank nodded, accepting the honest answer. "Well, when you figure it out, remember this. Opportunities like this don't come along every day, not for men like us out here on the frontier." He clapped Harlan on the shoulder. "Don't let fear make your decision for you." With that piece of wisdom delivered, Frank headed back to the bunkhouse, leaving Harlan alone with his thoughts in the star-filled night. The next morning, Harlan rode into Tropic earlier than necessary, arriving well before school would let out for the day. He used the time to handle various business in town, ordering supplies, speaking with the blacksmith about shoeing several horses, stopping by the sheriff's office to update Morgan on the incident with Henderson's men. As the school bell rang, signaling the end of the day's lessons, Harlan found himself standing across the street, watching as children poured out of the building, their voices high and excited after being contained all day. Willow appeared in the doorway, smiling as she bid them goodbye, reminding several to remember their assignments. He waited until the last child had departed before crossing the street. Willow looked up as he approached, her face brightening in a way that sent a warm jolt through his chest. "Harlan," she greeted him. "I was hoping you'd come. Is everything all right? Frank told me there was trouble with the Hendersons." "All sorted," he assured her, following her into the schoolhouse as she gathered her things. "Just boundary pushing, happens sometimes." "I worried," she admitted, stacking books on her desk. "Young Mr. Henderson seems the type to hold a grudge." "Nothing I can't handle," Harlan said confidently. "I'm sorry your visit was cut short." She shook her head. "Don't apologize. I understand that ranch emergencies take precedence." She looked up at him with a small smile. "Besides, it gives you a reason to come back and finish the tour another time." "I'd like that," he said honestly. As they walked to her cabin, Harlan found himself uncharacteristically nervous, his usual blunt manner failing him as he tried to find the right words for what he wanted to say. "Would you?" he began, just as Willow said. "I was thinking." They both stopped, then laughed, the tension breaking. "Ladies first," Harlan said, gesturing for her to continue. "I was thinking about cooking dinner," she said. "Here at the cabin, if you'd like to join me." "It won't be anything fancy, but I'd like that very much," he interrupted, relief washing through him that she had opened the door he'd been struggling to find. Her smile was warm. "Good. Saturday around 6. "I'll be here," he promised. As he turned to leave, Willow called after him. "Harlan, what were you going to ask?" He looked back at her, standing in the doorway of her small cabin, the afternoon sun catching in her hair, and found he couldn't remember ever seeing anything more beautiful. "The same thing," he said simply, just in a less graceful way. Her laugh followed him down the path, a sound he was coming to treasure more with each passing day. The week crawled by with agonizing slowness. Harlan threw himself into ranch work, trying to keep his mind occupied, but his thoughts continually drifted to Willow, to her smile, her laugh, the way she seemed to see past his rough exterior to something beneath that even he wasn't sure existed. By Saturday, he was a bundle of nerves poorly disguised as irritation, snapping at the ranch hands for minor infractions until Frank finally pulled him aside. "Why don't you head into town early?" he suggested diplomatically, "before you drive everyone to quit." Harlan had the grace to look sheepish. "That bad? Worse," Frank confirmed. "Go, clean up. Try not to scare the schoolteacher with whatever's got you tied in knots." Taking Frank's advice, Harlan bathed thoroughly, shaved with extra care, and put on his best clothes. He even stopped by the general store on his way to Willow's cabin, purchasing a small box of candies and a book of poetry he'd noticed her admiring on his last visit to town. When he arrived at her cabin, the delicious smell of cooking greeted him even before Willow opened the door. She was dressed in a simple but becoming blue dress, her hair arranged in a style more elaborate than her usual schoolteacher braid. "You're right on time," she said, ushering him in. "Dinner's almost ready." The cabin had been transformed. The small table was set with what appeared to be Willow's best dishes, a vase of late-blooming wildflowers in the center. Lanterns had been lit, casting a warm, golden glow over the room that made it seem both intimate and magical. "These are for you," Harlan said, somewhat awkwardly presenting the candies and book. "Just a small token." Willow's face lit up as she took the gifts. "Harlan, how thoughtful. I've been wanting to read this collection." She looked up at him with genuine pleasure. "Thank you." He nodded, pleased by her reaction, but unsure how to respond to her thanks. Compliments and gratitude still made him uncomfortable, though he was slowly learning to accept them from her. Dinner was simple but delicious: a hearty beef stew, freshly baked bread, and a pie that Willow admitted she had purchased from Mrs. Peterson rather than attempting herself. "My cooking has limits," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "And Mrs. Peterson's pies are legendary for good reason." As they ate, conversation flowed easily between them, covering everything from the progress of her students to the preparations at the double tea for the coming winter. Harlan found himself relaxing, the nervousness that had plagued him all week gradually dissipating in the warm comfort of Willow's company. After dinner, they moved to the small settee near the stove, sitting closer than propriety might strictly allow but not close enough to cause scandal. Willow poured coffee for them both, then settled beside him. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her tone more serious than it had been during dinner, "about having notions of family when you built your house." Harlan tensed slightly, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "Long time ago now." "Not so very long," she countered gently. "You're still a young man, Harlan," he snorted softly. 32's not young out here. Most men my age have a wife and half a dozen children by now." "And why don't you?" she asked, looking at him directly. "If you don't mind my asking." Harlan considered deflecting the question, but something in her expression encouraged honesty. "Never found the right woman, I suppose. Then as the years passed, got used to being alone. Started to think maybe that was just how it was meant to be. And now—" Her voice was soft, but her eyes never left his face. "Now." He paused, searching for words. "Now I'm not so sure." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Willow's hand rested on the settee between them, and after a moment's hesitation, Harlan covered it with his own. Her fingers turned, interlacing with his, the simple contact sending a current of warmth up his arm. "Willow," he began, his voice rougher than usual, "I'm not good at this, at saying what I feel, never have been." "You're doing fine," she encouraged softly. He took a deep breath. "Since you came to Tropic, everything's different. I'm different. I find myself thinking about you when you're not there, looking forward to seeing you again. It's new for me." "For me too," she admitted. "After what happened in Boston, I wasn't sure I could trust my judgment again. I certainly didn't expect to find, whatever this is, in Tropic, Utah." "And what is this?" he asked, needing to hear her define it. She smiled, a hint of shyness in her expression that he found endearing. "I think we both know it's more than friendship, Harlan. At least it is for me." Relief washed through him. "For me too," he confirmed, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Much more." They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing this mutual admission. Then Harlan, gathering his courage, asked the question that had been on his mind for days. "Would it be all right if I kissed you?" The directness of the question brought a flush to Willow's cheeks, but she nodded. "I'd like that very much." Harlan leaned forward, one hand coming up to gently cup her cheek as their lips met in a kiss that began tentatively, but quickly deepened into something that sent his heart racing. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that for a while now," he admitted. "I've been hoping you would," she confessed, her smile lighting something inside him that he hadn't known was dark. They spent the rest of the evening talking, occasionally interrupted by more kisses, as they began the process of truly knowing one another. Harlan found himself opening up in ways he never had before, sharing not just facts about his life, but the feelings that accompanied them, his determination to build something lasting after the poverty of his childhood, his pride in what the Double T had become, his occasional loneliness in the big house he'd built for a family that didn't exist. In turn, Willow spoke of her life in Boston, her close relationship with her parents, the pain of losing them both to illness within a year of each other. She told him more about her broken engagement, how she had been swept off her feet by a charming, persistent suitor, only to discover his darker nature after accepting his proposal. He didn't like being contradicted, she explained, her voice steady though Harlan could see the effort it cost her. At first, it seemed like normal disagreements, but over time his reactions became more extreme. When I finally ended things, he became threatening, followed me, confronted me in public. Harlan's hands had clenched into fists as she spoke, anger building at the thought of anyone frightening her. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Willow looked at him sharply. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "Harlan Tate, don't you dare lie to me," she said firmly. "You're thinking of hunting him down, aren't you?" Caught, Harlan had the grace to look sheepish. "The thought might have crossed my mind." To his surprise, she laughed, the tension breaking. "My protective cowboy," she said, touching his cheek gently. "He's 3,000 miles away and I'm here with you. That's all that matters now." "Still," Harlan grumbled, "man like that deserves a reckoning." "Perhaps," she agreed, "but not from you, not now. I've moved on, Harlan. I'm building a new life here. I don't want the past intruding on it." He nodded reluctantly, understanding her point even as the protective instinct remained. "If he ever shows his face in Tropic, then I trust you'll be the first to greet him," she finished with a small smile. "But let's not waste any more time talking about him. He's my past. You're my present." "And future?" Harlan asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Willow's eyes softened. "I'd like that very much," she said simply. It was late when Harlan finally took his leave, reluctant to go but aware of propriety and the need to protect Willow's reputation in the small town. At the door, he kissed her once more, lingering over it as though trying to store up the sensation for the days ahead. "When can I see you again?" he asked. "I'm free tomorrow afternoon," she replied. "After church. I'll come by," he promised. "Maybe we could ride out to the lake if the weather holds." "I'd like that." She reached up to straighten his collar, the domestic gesture feeling both new and strangely right. "Good night, Harlan." "Good night, Willow." He stepped into the cool night air, feeling lighter than he could remember feeling in years. As autumn deepened toward winter, Harlan and Willow's relationship flourished. They spent as much time together, as their respective responsibilities allowed riding when the weather permitted, reading by the fire in her cabin when it didn't, sharing meals and conversations, and increasingly passionate embraces. The town of Tropic observed this courtship with varying degrees of interest and approval. Some, like Frank and Sheriff Morgan, were openly supportive. Others, particularly the Henderson family, watched with thinly veiled disapproval. Most simply adjusted to the unexpected pairing of the gruff rancher and the refined schoolteacher, finding in it a source of gentle gossip but no real scandal. For Harlan, the most remarkable change was in himself. He found his natural brusqueness softening, at least when Willow was present. Words that once would have emerged as harsh commands or curt statements now found gentler expression. Not that he'd suddenly become a poet, he was still Harlan Tate, after all, but he was learning that there were ways to speak that didn't cause others to flinch or withdraw. The first time he noticed this change was during a visit to the schoolhouse. He'd arrived early to walk Willow home and found himself helping a young student who was struggling with a mathematics problem. When the boy made the same error for the third time, Harlan felt the familiar surge of impatience rising in his chest. "You're not paying attention," he started to snap, then caught sight of Willow watching him from her desk. The words died in his throat as he saw something in her expression, not reproach exactly, but a quiet expectation that he could do better. Taking a breath, Harlan modulated his tone. "Try again," he said, his voice lower, less harsh. "Look carefully at what you wrote." The mistake is small but important. The boy, who had tensed at Harlan's initial tone, relaxed slightly and bent over his slate with renewed concentration. When he finally spotted his error, his face lit up with the satisfaction of discovery rather than the relief of avoiding criticism. Later, as they walked to her cabin, Willow took his arm. "You were good with Timothy today," she observed. "He responds better to encouragement than criticism." "Don't we all?" Harlan replied, thinking of his own reaction to her gentle guidance versus the harsh discipline of his father. "Some more than others," she agreed. "But yes, I think it's a universal truth." It became a pattern between them, not Willow correcting him exactly, but her presence reminding him that there were other ways to express himself. He found himself choosing his words more carefully, considering their impact before speaking them aloud. And when he forgot, when the old harshness emerged, she didn't chastise him but simply placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent reminder that he was capable of better. The most significant test of this new approach came in early December, when tensions with the Henderson family reached a breaking point. Cattle from the Double T had been found shot on disputed range land, and Harlan rode into town in a cold fury to confront Henderson Sr. at his office. Willow happened to be leaving the general store as Harlan dismounted outside Henderson's land office, and one look at his face told her everything. "Harlan," she said, catching his arm as he strode past. "What's happened?" "Henderson's men shot 5 of my cattle," he growled, his voice tight with anger. "Found them this morning on the disputed section." "Are you certain it was them?" she asked, not releasing his arm. "Who else would it be?" he demanded. "Henderson's been pushing that boundary for months, trying to force me to sell that section to him. Now he's escalated to killing my stock." "What are you planning to do?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes were concerned. "Going to have it out with him, once and for all," Harlan replied, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. "Armed like that?" she asked quietly. Harlan paused, suddenly aware of his posture, his tone, the way his hand rested on his weapon. He saw genuine worry in Willow's eyes, not for Henderson, but for him and what might happen once words started flying. Taking a deep breath, he deliberately moved his hand away from his gun. "I'm not planning to shoot him," he said, his voice lower now. "Just want to talk." Words can be weapons too, she reminded him gently, especially when delivered in anger. He knew she was right. In his current state, any conversation with Henderson would quickly escalate to threats, possibly violence. And while part of him, the old Harlan, wanted exactly that confrontation, another part recognized the wisdom in Willow's concern. "What do you suggest?" he asked, making a visible effort to control his temper. "Wait," she said simply. "Go to the sheriff first, document what happened. Let the law handle it initially. If Henderson is responsible, let him make the first aggressive move where others can witness it." The strategic wisdom of this approach penetrated Harlan's anger. She wasn't asking him to back down, just to be smarter about how he proceeded. To use words as tools rather than weapons. "All right," he agreed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Sheriff's office first." Relief washed across Willow's face. "Thank you," she said, squeezing his arm. "I'm not asking you to let this go. Just to handle it in a way that protects you as well as your ranch." In the end, Willow's advice proved prescient. Sheriff Morgan took Harlan's report seriously, rode out to the Double T to view the dead cattle, and then approached Henderson with the evidence and witnesses. Faced with official scrutiny and the possibility of charges, Henderson was forced to acknowledge that his men had acted without authorization, and to make restitution for the lost animals. It was a more satisfactory resolution than a confrontation would have been, Harlan had to admit. And it had been achieved without a single threat or raised voice on his part. "You were right," he told Willow that evening as they sat by the fire in her cabin, "about handling Henderson that way. It's easier to see clearly when you're not the one directly involved," she said, her hand finding his. "And I had the advantage of not being raised to solve problems with my fists or my gun." "My father's approach to life was pretty simple," Harlan acknowledged. "Hit first, hit hard, and make sure they don't get up to hit back." "A difficult lesson to unlearn," she said, understanding in her voice. "But you're doing it, Harlan. I see the changes in you." "Because of you," he said, raising her hand to his lips. She shook her head slightly. "The capacity was always there. I just reminded you of it." As December progressed and Christmas approached, Harlan found himself thinking about the future with a clarity and purpose that had been absent from his life for years. The Double T was prospering. The dispute with Henderson had been resolved in his favor, and Willow had become the center of a life he'd never imagined possible. On the Sunday before Christmas, after church, Harlan took Willow for a ride into the foothills above the Double T. The day was clear and cold, the landscape transformed by a light dusting of snow that had fallen the night before. They rode to a sheltered clearing that offered a panoramic view of the valley below, where the ranch buildings looked like miniatures in the vast expanse of white-covered fields. "It's breathtaking," Willow said, dismounting to stand at the edge of the clearing. "You can see forever from here." Harlan joined her, taking her gloved hand in his. "I come up here sometimes to think, to remind myself of what I've built and what's still possible." She looked up at him, her cheeks pink from the cold, her green eyes bright. "And what is still possible, Harlan Tate?" He took a deep breath, feeling a nervousness he hadn't experienced since his first cattle drive. "More than I ever thought," he said honestly, "because of you." Reaching into his coat pocket, he withdrew a small box. "I had this made in Salt Lake City," he said, opening it to reveal a ring of delicately worked gold set with a single emerald. "It reminded me of your eyes." Willow's breath caught, her free hand coming up to cover her mouth. "I'm not good with fancy words," Harlan continued, his voice rougher than usual but deliberately soft. "But I love you, Willow Evans, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Her eyes filled with tears, but the smile that accompanied them was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Harlan, I would be honored to be your wife." With fingers that trembled slightly, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that conveyed all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally parted, both breathless and laughing, Harlan rested his forehead against hers. "I promise I'll try to be worthy of you," he said softly. "I can't guarantee I won't ever say the wrong thing or lose my temper, but I'll always try to be better for you." "I don't want you to be perfect," Willow assured him, her hands framing his face. "I just want you to be you, the real you, not the harsh exterior you show the world. The man who built a house for a family he dreamed of having. The man who fixed my stove without being asked. The man who sees the best in children even when they make mistakes." He kissed her again, overwhelmed by her acceptance of him, flaws and all. "When?" he asked. "How soon can we be married?" She laughed at his eagerness. "Well, I'll need to fulfill my contract with the school board through the spring term. Would June be soon enough?" "If it has to be," he replied with mock resignation that made her laugh again. "Though I'd marry you tomorrow if you were willing." "June," she repeated firmly. "That gives us time to plan properly, and," she added with a teasing smile, "for you to prepare the house. I suspect the master bedroom could use a feminine touch." "The whole house could," he admitted. "It was built with a woman in mind, but it's never had one to make it truly a home." "Until now," she said, leaning into him as they both gazed out over the valley that would be their shared domain. "Until now," he agreed, his arm tightening around her waist. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Tropic, generating a flurry of well wishes and congratulations. Frank was openly delighted, having declared months earlier that Willow was exactly what the boss needed. The school board expressed regret at losing their teacher, but agreed that the end of the spring term would be a natural transition point. Even the Henderson family, perhaps recognizing that their battle was lost, sent a polite note of congratulation. Harlan suspected it was more Mrs. Henderson's doing than her husband or son's, but he appreciated the gesture nonetheless. It seemed that Tropic was prepared to accept the union of the rough rancher and the refined schoolteacher without reservation. The winter passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Harlan undertook renovations to the house, adding touches that he hoped would please Willow: new curtains for the windows, a proper dressing table for the bedroom, bookshelves in the study to accommodate her extensive collection. Willow divided her time between teaching and learning more about the operation of the ranch, determined to be a true partner in the life they would share. They were married on a perfect June day in the Tropic church, with Frank standing as Harlan's best man and the widow Johnson, who had become Willow's close friend, serving as her matron of honor. The church was filled to capacity, the entire town turning out to witness the union that many had thought improbable at best. Harlan, standing at the altar in his best suit, watched with undisguised wonder as Willow walked toward him on Sheriff Morgan's arm, the sheriff having volunteered to give her away in the absence of her father. She was radiant in a gown of ivory silk that she had ordered from Salt Lake City, her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant style beneath a veil of delicate lace. As she reached him and placed her hand in his, Harlan felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. This woman, this intelligent, strong, beautiful woman had chosen him, had seen past his rough exterior to something worthy of love. It was a miracle he still couldn't quite believe. The ceremony itself was brief, Reverend Phillips for once keeping his remarks concise. When asked to recite his vows, Harlan surprised everyone, including Willow, by speaking from memory rather than repeating after the minister. "I, Harlan, take you, Willow, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice clear and steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "I promise to love and cherish you, to honor and respect you, to protect and provide for you, for all the days of my life." Simple words, perhaps, but delivered with such sincerity that many in the congregation found themselves blinking back tears. Willow's own eyes shimmered as she repeated her vows, her voice wavering slightly but growing stronger with each promise made. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, Harlan took Willow's face gently between his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that belied his reputation for roughness. The church erupted in applause, led by Frank's enthusiastic whooping from the front pew. The celebration that followed at the Double T was the largest gathering the ranch had ever hosted. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food contributed by every household in Tropic. Music, dancing, and laughter filled the afternoon and extended well into the evening as the community celebrated not just a wedding, but what many saw as a perfect union of strength and grace. As the last guests departed and they finally found themselves alone in the house that was now truly theirs together, Harlan turned to his wife with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Mrs. Tate," he said, testing the sound of it. Willow smiled, reaching up to loosen his tie. "I like the sound of that," she said, "though I expect the children will still call me Miss Evans until they get used to the change." "They'll adjust," Harlan assured her, drawing her into his arms. "Children are adaptable, more so than some adults, speaking from experience." She teased, her hands resting on his chest. "Maybe," he admitted with a small smile. "Took me 32 years to learn that there are better ways to express myself than barking orders and making threats." And you've become quite adept at some of those other ways," she murmured, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. Later, as they lay tangled together in the bed that now seemed perfectly sized for two, Willow propped herself on an elbow to study her husband's face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Happy?" she asked softly. Harlan reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle in a way that still surprised him sometimes. "More than I knew was possible," he replied honestly. "You—" Her smile was answer enough, but she leaned down to kiss him anyway. "Completely," she whispered against his lips. In the years that followed, the Double T prospered under their joint stewardship. Willow brought a fresh perspective to the ranch operations, suggesting innovations that Harlan might never have considered, but that proved beneficial. Though she no longer taught formally at the school, having been replaced by a capable young woman from Nevada, she maintained her connection to education by establishing a small library in Tropic, with books donated from across the territory. Their first child, a son they named James Franklin Tate after both their fathers, arrived a year after their wedding. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth, and eventually by another son, Daniel. The house that Harlan had built with vague notions of family became filled with the sounds of children's laughter, of music from the piano Harlan had surprised Willow with on their first anniversary, of animated discussions around the dinner table. The rough-spoken rancher who had once made a schoolteacher flinch with his harsh words became known throughout the territory as a fair but firm businessman, a devoted husband, and a father whose children never feared his voice, no matter how strongly he might feel about something. He learned, with Willow's patient guidance, that a whispered word often carried more weight than a shouted command. That strength could be conveyed through calm certainty rather than forceful demands. For her part, Willow blossomed in the life she had chosen, finding in Harlan a partner who valued her mind as much as her heart, who supported her initiatives in the community, who looked at her after 20 years of marriage with the same wonder he had shown on their wedding day. On their 20th anniversary, they rode together to the clearing in the foothills where Harlan had proposed. The ranch below had grown, the original boundaries expanded through careful acquisitions over the years. The town of Tropic had grown as well, now boasting a proper hotel, a bank, and even a small newspaper. "Did you ever imagine this?" Willow asked, gesturing to the valley below. "When you first staked your claim on the Double T?" Harlan considered the question, his arm around her waist as they stood together. "Parts of it," he admitted. "The ranch, the cattle, the success." He looked down at her, silver now threading through her chestnut hair, lines of laughter around her eyes that only made her more beautiful to him. "But not you. You I never could have imagined." "No," she teased. "A Boston schoolteacher wasn't part of your grand plan." "Not even in my wildest dreams," he confirmed, pulling her closer. "You were the best kind of surprise, Willow Tate, the kind that changes everything for the better." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder in the familiar gesture of 2 decades of shared life. "We changed each other, I think," she said thoughtfully. "You taught me to be stronger, to stand my ground." "And I taught me to whisper," he finished, his voice dropping to the softer register that had become his natural tone with her and their children. "To use words as something other than weapons." "A fair exchange," she said, smiling up at him. "More than fair," he agreed, bending to kiss her with the tenderness that had become second nature over the years. "The best bargain I ever made." As they rode back to the ranch, to the home they had built together, to the children and grandchildren who would gather that evening to celebrate their anniversary, Harlan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the angry young man who had staked everything on a patch of Utah wilderness to the man he was now, still strong, still determined, but tempered by love and the wisdom that came from 2 decades with a woman who had seen his best self even when he couldn't. The rough-spoken cowboy had learned to whisper, and in doing so had found a voice that carried farther, meant more, and built a life richer than he could ever have imagined alone.